There's something unsettling about the moment when trust becomes your greatest vulnerability. It's that moment when the person you thought you could rely on, the one you believed would protect you, turns out to be the one you need protecting from. We live in a world where connection, the very thing that's supposed to make us safe, can sometimes be the most dangerous thing we ever encounter. Tonight, I want to share a story that haunts me, not because of its brutality but because of its familiarity. It's a story about a woman, Christa Gilley, who believed in trust, a woman who opened her heart to someone she thought she could rely on. What happened to her could happen to any one of us who dares to believe in companionship. A story about how the darkness can hide behind the person who says they love you. Christa was a woman like so many others, kind, caring, professional, and dedicated to her family. But in the quiet of her home, a nightmare was brewing. Her marriage, once built on promises of love and security, became a trap. And her trust was shattered in the most unimaginable way, leading to the violent end of her life and the life of her unborn child. Imagine this, a loving mother of two, pregnant with her third child, living in a peaceful suburban neighborhood. Her husband, someone who swore to protect her, becomes the person who ends her life. Mongerson Gilley, a man who was supposed to cherish and protect his family, is now accused of strangling Christa to death. How could someone she trusted so deeply, someone she had built a life with, betray her in such a heart-wrenching and violent way? Christa Gilley's death was not just a tragedy, it was a devastating betrayal. A woman who was preparing to bring new life into the world was killed by the very man who was supposed to care for her. But that's not the whole story. Behind the tragic death of Christa, there was a story of manipulation, control, and deception that led to her untimely death. I need to ask you, how well do you really know the people closest to you? Have you ever missed warning signs that someone you trusted was slowly changing? We hear about these cases, we read about them, but how often do we ask ourselves, could this happen to me? How could we have stopped it before it was too late? In Christa's case, what began as a quiet suburban life ended in an unimaginable tragedy. Was there something we all missed? Was there a moment when someone could have stepped in to prevent the horror from unfolding? Was there a way to stop the terror before it happened? How could a man who vowed to love his wife become her killer? Have you ever ignored red flags in a relationship? Have you ever been in a relationship that seemed all glamorous, a fairy tale wedding, a safe and happy home, only to see it turn sideways, becoming the opposite of what you thought you knew? Have you ever missed the signs that someone you loved and trusted was not the person you thought they were? Share your insights with us in the comments below. It could help someone stay safe, avoid the pitfalls of control and manipulation, and recognize the early signs before it's too late. Christa Gilley was just 38 years old when her life was tragically cut short. A mother of two, a dedicated wife, and a professional whose career was built on helping others, Christa's life appeared to be everything she had worked for. Her Facebook page, filled with family photos and smiles, painted a picture of a woman who had it all. Her two children, always the focal point of her life, and her husband, Lee, by her side, made up the core of her world. She was a woman who believed deeply in family, in creating a life that was both fulfilling and safe for her children. From the outside, Christa's life looked almost perfect. A loving mother, a dedicated wife, a professional in the field of physical therapy. She had graduated from Clemson University with a bachelor's degree in public health science and later earned a doctorate in physical therapy from the University of Pittsburgh. Her career at Memorial Hermann Health System in Houston spanned over a decade, where she worked as a rehab educator and senior physical therapist. She was known for her professionalism, her drive, and her deep commitment to her patients, all while being a loving and caring mother. But despite her dedication to her work and her family, cracks began to show in what seemed like a perfect life. Beneath the surface, something was changing, something that no one could have predicted. Christa wasn't just a mother and a professional, she was also a friend to many. Her friends and family described her as someone who always made time for others. She was the one who remembered birthdays, the one who checked in on loved ones during tough times, the one who always seemed to have a smile on her face no matter how hard things got. She had an infectious laugh, a warmth that made her loved by everyone who knew her. Her colleagues saw her as an inspiring woman, a beacon of strength in the workplace. Her family, her parents, Linda and Lars, often spoke of how strong and independent she was, but they also noticed the subtle changes in her behavior. The cracks in her perfect life were starting to show. In the months leading up to her tragic death, there was an undeniable shift in Christa. Those closest to her started to see the weight of something dark settling on her shoulders. Christa became more withdrawn, less her usual self. Friends and family began to sense the tension that had grown in her marriage. While Christa had always been a loving, devoted wife and mother, something had changed between her and Lee. She confided in those closest to her about her growing concerns, her fears for the future, and her frustration with her marriage. Christa's relationship with Lee had started like so many others, full of love, hope, and promise. They married in January of 2017, just a few months after meeting. At the time, everything seemed perfect. They shared dreams of a future together, a family, and a life built on mutual respect. But over time, as often happens in relationships, things changed. Lee, who had once been her partner, began to show signs of possessiveness and control. It started slowly, with small, seemingly insignificant moments that Christa brushed off. But soon, those moments turned into patterns. Lee's behavior became more demanding, his need for control more evident. He wasn't just her partner anymore, he had become someone she feared. She started confiding in her family about her growing concerns. She spoke about feeling suffocated, trapped in a relationship that had turned toxic. She began to discuss the possibility of divorce, of leaving Lee, and even talked about seeking custody of their 2 children. But Lee, instead of accepting her decision, began to escalate his behavior. He started manipulating her more openly, making threats, and creating an environment that was no longer safe. What was once a marriage full of promise had transformed into a volatile and unhealthy relationship. Christa was no longer the woman Lee had fallen in love with. She had become a target for his control, a pawn in a psychological game that would eventually lead to her death. She started making plans for a future outside of the marriage, but she knew it wouldn't be easy. Leaving Lee would mean facing his wrath, and she had no idea just how far he would go to keep her under his control. Christa's decision to leave Lee wasn't made lightly. She didn't just want to end her marriage, she wanted to protect her children, to give them a life free from the toxicity that had invaded their home. But she also understood the risks. She knew that her decision to seek a divorce and custody could escalate the situation. Unfortunately, Christa had no way of knowing just how much further Lee was willing to go to hold on to control. In the weeks leading up to her tragic death, Christa had become increasingly concerned for her safety. She spoke to her family about her fears, but the real depth of the danger she was in didn't become clear until it was too late. Lee had already started showing signs of instability, his controlling behavior becoming more erratic. Yet, despite these warning signs, no one could have predicted that it would lead to murder. As the days passed, Christa tried to keep her family life as normal as possible. She went about her daily routine, caring for her children, keeping up with her professional obligations, and trying to maintain some semblance of normalcy. But in the back of her mind, she knew the situation with Lee was becoming untenable. She didn't want to worry her family, so she kept many of her concerns to herself, trying to handle everything on her own. But as the months passed, the pressure began to mount. The emotional toll of living in an increasingly volatile situation began to take its toll on Christa. She began to show signs of stress, of anxiety, as she faced the reality of her marriage crumbling around her. And as much as she tried to protect her children from the storm that was brewing, it was becoming clear that there was no way out without risking everything. Christa's last days were filled with the haunting awareness that her marriage was about to end. But what she didn't know was that Lee was already planning his final act to regain control, an act that would cost her life and the life of their unborn child. The last few months of Christa's life were filled with anxiety and fear. She had begun taking steps to protect herself, such as installing security cameras and taking other precautions. But the psychological toll of the relationship, combined with the growing realization that her decision to leave would trigger a violent response, was wearing her down. Her family began to notice that Christa was becoming more withdrawn, less able to hide her feelings. She had been a woman who always put others first, who carried herself with grace and kindness, but in the weeks before her death, it was clear that the weight of her situation had become unbearable. She knew the stakes were high, but she had no idea just how far Lee would go to keep her under his control. Just days before her tragic death, Christa made plans. She spoke about her concerns to those closest to her. She was preparing for a future without Lee, but what she didn't know was that Lee had already begun making plans of his own. The final confrontation between them would come soon. Only one of them would walk away. The timeline leading up to Christa Gilley's tragic death is a chilling narrative of calculated manipulation, deceit, and betrayal. Every event, every seemingly innocent conversation, and every action taken by Lee Gilley was a carefully crafted attempt to conceal the truth. From the initial harassing messages to the ultimate fatal confrontation, the web of lies he spun only deepened the dark reality that would eventually unfold. As investigators peeled back the layers of this haunting case, they began to realize the full extent of Lee's control over Christa. The psychological games, the emotional torment, and the constant manipulation had all been part of his method to dominate and coerce her into a life of fear. What had begun as a simple disagreement between a husband and wife soon spiraled into a deadly game, one that ended in the loss of Christa's life and the life of their unborn child. The night of October 7, 2023, seemed ordinary, at least on the surface. But beneath the calm of the Gilley household, tension was building. Lee had prepared for this moment, this night that would change everything. After an argument with Christa, which had become all too familiar in their relationship, Lee took matters into his own hands. Around 11:30 p.m., he made the call to 911, claiming that Christa had overdosed and that he was performing CPR. He described her as suicidal, trying to paint the picture of a woman who had given up, a woman he portrayed as unstable. However, when paramedics arrived, the scene they found was nothing like the one Lee had described. Christa lay unresponsive, bruises marking her face, and clear signs of a violent struggle visible on her body. Her neck bore the marks of strangulation, and a stab wound to her chest added another layer of horror to the scene. The paramedics immediately recognized the discrepancy between Lee's version of events and the evidence before them. What was meant to look like a suicide was, in fact, a carefully staged murder. Lee's manipulation of the scene was evident. The way he described his wife's behavior and the supposed overdose was an attempt to steer the investigation away from him. His actions, from the timing of the 911 call to his behavior at the scene, suggested premeditation. Christa had been dead for several hours before he dialed for help, a detail that further undermined his story. And there was no sign of forced entry or any struggle outside their home, pointing to the fact that the attack had been carried out by someone with intimate knowledge of Christa's movements, someone who had access to her and could plan such an act without suspicion. At first, authorities suspected suicide. Christa's history, though, and the bruising on her body did not align with the usual signs of an overdose or a desperate act. Her wounds were not self-inflicted. And when the medical examiner confirmed the cause of death as strangulation and trauma, the investigation took a sharp turn. The death of Christa, a beloved wife and mother, was no longer just a tragedy, it was a crime. But the true horror was that it was a crime committed by the one person she had trusted the most, her husband. The situation became even more heartbreaking when it was revealed that Christa was pregnant with their third child at the time of her death. Not only had Lee taken his wife's life, but he had also taken that of their unborn child. A mother who had hoped for a brighter future for her family was now gone, and with her, the dreams she had for the children she was raising. It made the crime even more tragic, an innocent life lost in the most devastating way. As the investigation deepened, it became evident that Lee's actions were part of a pattern of psychological abuse. The messages he had sent, the fake persona he had created, and the way he manipulated Christa into living in fear were all pieces of a larger puzzle. The harassment that had gone on for months, the false ex-boyfriend creating a sense of paranoia and distress in Christa's life, was all part of Lee's strategy to maintain control. He was not just the abuser, he was the mastermind behind this psychological warfare. The investigation team uncovered digital evidence that revealed Lee's role in creating this twisted game. Fake messages, burner phones, and fabricated stories about Christa's supposed instability painted a clear picture of a man who had no regard for the woman he vowed to love. He had been pulling the strings behind the scenes, ensuring that Christa felt trapped, vulnerable, and alone. She was unable to escape the web he had spun for her, and ultimately, it cost her everything. As the authorities pieced together the timeline of events, it became clear that Lee's entire story was built on lies. The so-called suicide attempt was a lie. The version of events he gave to the police was a fabrication designed to shift the blame and protect himself. But the evidence didn't lie. The wounds on Christa's body, the inconsistencies in Lee's account, and the disturbing discoveries about his behavior all pointed to one truth. He had murdered his wife, and he had done so with chilling intent. The investigation also revealed the emotional manipulation that had occurred over the years. Lee had worked tirelessly to control every aspect of Christa's life, isolating her from the people who could have helped her and convincing her that her fears were unwarranted. He had convinced her to stay in a relationship that was toxic and emotionally suffocating. He knew her weaknesses, her hopes, and her fears, and he used them against her. And as the walls closed in around him, he made sure to cover his tracks, spinning a narrative of a tragic, misunderstood death that would only further entrench his manipulation. But as investigators continued to gather evidence, the cracks in Lee's story grew wider. Christa's stalker log, a detailed record she had kept of the harassment she had faced, became a crucial piece of evidence. It revealed not only the timeline of events leading up to her death but also the full scope of Lee's psychological control. She had documented her fears, the strange messages, the mounting pressure, and her attempts to protect herself. But despite her best efforts, she couldn't escape the man who had once promised to love her. As the pieces came together, it became clear. Lee Gilley had planned his actions with precision. He had manipulated his wife's world, distorted her reality, and orchestrated a murder so carefully that for a brief moment, it seemed as though he might get away with it. But the truth always finds a way to surface. The evidence, both physical and digital, was irrefutable. And as the authorities connected the dots, it became clear that the man Christa had trusted had become the very person who had taken her life. As the investigation unfolded, it became apparent that Lee's explanation was not adding up. While he was busy giving his version of events, investigators were already piecing together the evidence. Forensic teams began to collect every scrap of physical evidence from the scene, including fingerprints, fibers, and DNA that could have been crucial. One of the most telling pieces of evidence was Christa's stalker log. A simple notebook, meticulously kept over several months, chronicled the strange and unsettling messages that had been sent to her. The log was a detailed record of harassment that Christa had endured, tracking emails, texts, and even strange encounters that Lee had made sure she didn't speak about publicly. This log would become a key piece in the puzzle, offering insight into just how much Christa had been suffering in the months leading up to her death. But there was something more chilling: the digital evidence. Investigators found evidence that pointed directly to Lee being behind the harassment. Through digital forensics, they discovered that the burner phones used to send threatening messages to Christa were linked back to Lee's personal accounts. Not only that, but his devices contained searches about human anatomy. How long does it take for someone to lose consciousness? What amount of pressure is needed to render someone unconscious? This was no accident. This was not a desperate husband trying to explain a tragic death. This was the work of someone meticulously planning a crime, trying to cover his tracks while pushing the blame onto someone else. The clues were there, and the investigation began to focus solely on Lee. The authorities had already ruled out the possibility of an outside perpetrator. Lee Gilley was the one who had orchestrated the harassment, manipulated his wife's emotions, and ultimately killed her. The arrest came as investigators pieced together the mounting evidence that linked Lee directly to the crime. The evidence was overwhelming, and Lee's arrest was just the beginning of the legal proceedings that would follow. For Christa's family, the arrest of her husband marked a painful but necessary step toward justice. But even with Lee in custody, the family was left grappling with the reality of their loss. Their daughter and son would never again experience the love and warmth of their mother, and the family struggled with the knowledge that the man they had trusted with their sister and daughter was the one who had taken her life. But even as Lee was placed in handcuffs, the true depth of the deception began to emerge. The investigation into the months leading up to Christa's death revealed layers of manipulation and control. Lee had been plotting for months to regain control of Christa, using manipulation, gaslighting, and fabricated threats to keep her in a state of fear and uncertainty. But when she finally decided to leave him, he felt he had no other option but to resort to violence. The trial against Lee Mongerson Gilley began in April 2025, and it didn't take long for the courtroom drama to unfold. The case had already been sensationalized by the media, and the public was eager to know how such a tragedy could have occurred. Christa's family, devastated by the loss, was ready for justice to be served. Prosecutors painted a chilling picture of the months leading up to Christa's death. They argued that Lee had been emotionally abusing Christa. Lee had set up a complex web of lies, trying to force Christa into a state of constant fear and anxiety. It wasn't enough for him to control her through psychological manipulation. He wanted complete power over her life, and when she threatened to leave, he took the ultimate step. He murdered her. The courtroom was tense as the prosecution presented the stalker log, the digital evidence, and expert testimony that painted a clear picture of how Lee had orchestrated the entire situation. The defense, however, tried to argue that Lee was devastated by his wife's death and that there was no clear motive. But the evidence was too overwhelming to dismiss. Lee had created a false narrative, trying to make Christa's death appear as a tragic suicide, but the truth was much darker. As the trial progressed, more details emerged about Lee's actions, including the months of manipulation and emotional abuse. Christa had kept a detailed record of everything, and it was clear that she had been trying to escape from Lee's control. Her family's pain was palpable as they listened to the evidence presented in court, and the realization that Christa had been living in fear for so long was devastating. In April 2025, After a dramatic trial filled with emotional testimony and overwhelming evidence, the jury delivered its verdict: guilty on all charges. Mongerson Gilley was convicted of capital murder, 2 counts of stalking, and criminal impersonation. The conviction was a victory for justice, but the pain for Christa's family was far from over. The courtroom erupted in mixed emotions. Some felt a sense of relief, knowing that the man responsible for Christa's death had been held accountable. But for her family, the victory was bittersweet. No verdict could bring back the life they had lost. Christa's children would grow up without their mother, and the hole left by her death would never be filled. Lee was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. As the gavel came down, there was a sense of finality to the proceedings, but it was hard for anyone in the courtroom to escape the grief that lingered in the air. The man who had taken Christa's life would never walk free again, but her family would continue to carry the weight of the tragedy with them. Since his conviction, Lee Gilley has been incarcerated at the Sterling Correctional Facility in Colorado. The former husband and father now faces the harsh reality of life behind bars, a fate that was sealed after his conviction for the brutal murder of his wife, Christa. But for Christa's family, life has continued, though the emotional weight of their loss remains with them every single day. Christa's family has taken her death as an impetus for action, becoming vocal advocates for victims of domestic violence. What they once struggled to fully comprehend has now been transformed into a mission. They are now pushing for greater awareness about coercive control, stalking, and the lethal potential of emotional manipulation, issues they were tragically forced to confront far too late. Her children, who were left without a mother, are now growing up with a legacy that will forever be marred by the loss of their mother at the hands of the person they should have been able to trust the most. Christa's story is not just one of personal tragedy but a symbol of the many lives affected by domestic violence. Her family's courage in speaking out continues to raise awareness about the dangers of coercive control and emotional abuse, drawing attention to the signs that many often overlook. Meanwhile, Lee's story is one of a man who seemingly had everything but was willing to destroy the one person who truly mattered to him, simply because he couldn't control her. The case has resonated deeply with the public, shining a light on the complexities of emotional abuse and the manipulation that occurs behind closed doors. The reality of how quickly an abuser can escalate their behavior, using love as a weapon, has sparked widespread conversations. Lee Gilley's actions are a textbook example of how a manipulative person can manipulate and destroy the life of someone they claim to love, twisting affection into control and violence. Experts have weighed in, noting that emotional abuse can be just as lethal as physical violence, and sometimes even more insidious. Gilley's prolonged psychological abuse of Christa, coupled with the physical violence that eventually ended her life, was a devastating crescendo that left behind more than just physical scars. It left a profound emotional wound, one that will echo through the lives of Christa's children, her family, and everyone who loved her. This case has also prompted a larger discussion about how many victims suffer in silence, too afraid or too manipulated to reach out for help until it's too late. There is a growing awareness in society that the warning signs of coercive control need to be recognized earlier, and the systems meant to protect victims must be more attuned to this silent form of abuse. Christa's tragic story is a sobering reminder of the importance of recognizing the signs of emotional abuse and manipulation before it's too late. Her death was not just a senseless act of violence, it was the culmination of months of calculated emotional torment. Her children will grow up without the loving mother they so desperately needed, and her family will forever mourn a loss that should never have happened. This case raises difficult questions. What could have been done differently? Could someone have noticed the warning signs earlier? Could Christa have been saved from the man she once loved? These are questions we may never fully answer, but they serve as a crucial wake-up call for all of us. Domestic violence doesn't always leave physical scars. Sometimes the damage is hidden beneath the surface, and sometimes it's only too late when we see the full scope of the destruction. If you or someone you know is experiencing emotional or physical abuse, please reach out for help. Don't wait until it's too late. The National Domestic Violence Hotline is available 24/7 at 1-800-799-SAFE. There are people who can help. There are resources available, and no one should ever feel alone in this struggle. Like, subscribe, and share this video to raise awareness about the dangers of emotional abuse, coercive control, and the vital importance of recognizing the signs of an abusive relationship. Together, we can spread the message and help prevent further tragedies like this one. Justice for Christa and her children means ensuring that no one else has to suffer in silence. Your voice can be part of that change.